Venri Chapter 30. Timeline. Citadel Party. Garrus. He was really, really drunk. Not a little drunk. Not sorta drunk. Ring call shots with Rex, Grunt, and Shepard drunk. He didn't mind losing to the Krogan because they could just suck it into their humps or something. Morim being entirely clear-eyed was an issue. Fortunately, as Morim had told him often, his ego could take any number of hits. He'd been sitting still for a little while, and Zaid had come over to give him some ideas about making the Shepard-Vicarian love nest a little more secure. Sounded like fun. Most everything sounded like fun right about now. He'd also like to go outside that main picture window and shoot a few test shots to see if he could hit some of the people in the other apartments, just for academic and adrenaline purposes. But he wouldn't. While he was going upstairs to check out the hot tub, his feet got away from him and he had to grab the railing. He heard Morim laugh, and she broke away from the group she was talking to, involving lots of push-ups, apparently. She sauntered. No balance issues, damn it. Over. Hey there. I have never seen you trip. Do it again. I take requests. I could do it again, but I need some incentive. He hooked a finger under a strap on her dress and pulled her forward, bent down to kiss her. She looked at him with clear adoration in her eyes, and his knees went south along with his coordination. He'd stopped being shocked that she loved him, but he would never, ever stop being affected by the way she looked at him. Her arms came around him and her hands settled on his ass. She goosed him biotically right through his armor, and he let out a strangled half-groan and half-whoop. He pulled back to look at her, and her eyes were laughing. He leaned back down and nibbled dramatically on her mouth. He started to drag her upstairs. Everyone else be damned. But she put her hands on his shoulders. We have guests, and you owe me a trip. He waggled his brow plates. How about I go do push-ups instead? That would be cheating. Using muscles while being Turian. Look at them. They're only human, just like me. Pfft, bullshit, only human. Why aren't you over there doing push-ups? I'd like to see that. She raised her brow. Weren't you headed somewhere? Oh, right. Zaid. Have to keep an eye on the guy, or he'll set the apartment on fire. At least fire. I'm concerned, Garrus. I don't really believe that you're not encouraging Zaid in his more homicidal projects. Garrus shook his head quickly. Oh, damn, that made him dizzy. No, I just want to know what he's doing. Remember that whole thing about tents and pissing or something? Or something. You are so full of shit. He patted her on the head absently. Ring call. I'm full of ring call. Stupid Krogan. I bet you can't even say Thulium anymore. He made a concentrating face. It was pretend, mostly. Thulium. Okay, you may be right. You'll lose your nerd cred. I'll get it back when I'm sober, I promise. I just can't promise when that'll be. She turned him and pointed him upstairs. All right, love. Go have your pissing tent. Ugh. He did one more dramatic trip on his way up, listening to her giggle behind him. Shepard. She mingled with the crowd, listening mostly, asking people to tell their stories, introducing people to each other, listening to ribbing and arguments. Her husband was crazy and drunk, but he was happy. She would love to go upstairs and kick Zaid out of the hot tub and drag Garrus in, but she was also grateful to have some of her favorite people under one roof, like a border collie with the herd within the bounds of the fences. She wished Ashley, Morden, Thane, and Legion were here. She was nostalgic and heavy with meaning this evening. She even wished her parents were here. She'd never even tried to find them. It seemed a lost opportunity now, too late to make any sort of connection or understand. Records that might have existed on Earth were likely lost now. These people were her family. Garrus was her family. She wished Tensir and Solana could be here. She wished Villarine were still alive, that she could have met her colleagues, her friends, these unique people. She remembered people she'd lost over time. Too many, even before she'd heard of a Reaper. Now uncounted and uncountable. All her feelings of friends and camaraderie had heavy counterweights attached to them, though she knew to stay buoyed, to stay inspired, to be inspiring. They needed to see that from her. Regardless of whether or not she was confident, she needed to appear that way. The odds were incalculable, but she imagined her chances of survival were very low. The odds of Garrus and her both making it out alive were even lower, the loss of one contributing to the loss of the other. These were the moments when she focused on the window of opportunity, no matter how small. Time had changed her so drastically that her normal ways of coping were no longer enough. Before Saren, she'd been willing to die, and that window of opportunity had been her entire focus. Before the Collectors, she'd been frantic about not having enough time with Garrus. She hadn't expected to live, had believed that the label of suicide mission was prophecy. Tragedy had been confined to those who had volunteered for it. Now she had hope and a reason to live, and she'd had an extra year of living. She'd been granted more of a gift of life, and she knew enough to be humble. Spirits, please, bless your daughter once again. I need to see him whole and well for years. We should have 99 years left. Please. Here was where needing Garrus gave her choices she'd never had to make. She'd never been this vulnerable to someone else. But he was still her crew and her bondmate, and the urge to protect him was stronger than the urge to protect herself. Right now, she would lie straight to his face about their success odds and try to feel it so completely, so confidently, that he couldn't smell the fear on her. She would love to melt into his arms, allow him to hold her as she cried about the future and the vanishing possibility of it. But she wouldn't allow that. He needed to believe. He needed to believe that she believed. Everybody needed to believe that she believed, and to not be able to smell it on her. Garrus had made her a better liar, if that were possible, weeding out the tells and cues that he pointed out to her, making her better able to eliminate them or manufacture them as needed. It was a lie, And she was lying about her life and her death, and she was breaking her word to him through omission. Wasn't she? Should she instead go to him, collapse in his arms, and pour out doubt and fear? No. He needed her, and she needed to do this. He needed her to not tell him that she doubted the Crucible, doubted the massed forces of the alliance she had forged was going to be enough. It was possible that her expiration date was shorter than that on the milk in her refrigerator. He knew that she was concerned, that she was stressed, that she was weighed down, but she wouldn't confirm the extent of it. There would be no more dramatics, no more confessions, no more catharsis. It wasn't exactly a lie, but even if it was, she wasn't going to change it. This was her job, and she didn't need to spell out exactly what their odds were, and she would bet anything that he wouldn't ask, that he'd want to distract her from it himself. Overwhelming odds were not hard to calculate, and he was not stupid. In an odd way, they shared the intimacy of manufacturing confidence to inspire one another. They could do so much worse. Garrus, please don't make me lie to you. Please don't ask. For now, she needed for these people and her husband to know that she had faith in them, that she valued them, that whatever the future called for, she would answer. She would open that door and walk through, and what would happen would happen. It would be better if Garrus believed she thought 100% that they would succeed, and to then possibly fail him, than to let him believe that she had doubts and allow those to come true. Forgive me, Garrus, if I go to my death knowing where I'm going. I want you to know that I love you with every breath, and that I will try to spend whatever short time I have living with you, instead of fearing dying. I will fake it until I make it, or break it. I am so tired. She briefly mourned the inability to get drunk, and then imagined her crying on Jack's entirely freaked out shoulder, and didn't regret it at all. She needed to be strong. She worked her way through the party and made sure she talked to everyone, and made sure that everyone got a sincere hug. Except for Javik. Javik and Liara were talking, heads close, and she interrupted only briefly to take Liara's hand, pull her to her feet, and give her a long hug. She quirked a smile and turned to Javik and gave him a respectful thumbs up. Javik stood and gravely walked to her and embraced her, then pulled back, his expression reflecting what he'd garnered from touching her. She almost cried. Garrus. He was sober now. Kinda. Almost getting electrocuted can do that to a person. After the lights finished flickering, he told Zaid that was possibly the wrong wire. Zaid was too busy laughing. Garrus told him, "We're not telling anybody about this." Zaid was wheezing between laughter. "I have no idea what the fuck just happened anyway. It was beautiful, though." Garrus patted Zaid absently on the shoulder and then pushed himself up from there, Zaid swearing and falling forward, then laughing some more directly into the floor. He told Zaid, "I'm gonna go find my bondmate. You should clear out of here unless you want to witness some things. Pfft. Everyone's seen those things, Vicarian. You spawned a new category of sex vid. Garrus grinned. Involuntary sex vids. Yeah, I could tell by your voice. Cocky bastard. Oh, hell. That was an unintentional pun. Out. Zaid pushed off the floor. Fine. I'm gonna go find Samara. I'm wearing her down. Garrus shrugged. More likely you get your neck crushed under her heel. Who says I'm not into that? Garrus put his hands up, acknowledging he was out of his depth, and then they both walked somewhat unsteadily downstairs, a whiff of ozone following Garrus. Moram called everyone over for a picture, sparing him the work of walking around and avoiding people in order to find her. When they sat down, she slid her hand over his back, biotics flaring again, so he turned to look at her with a startled smile. And she was looking at him with her adoring eyes, and that's how the picture was taken. Adoring, but tired. He knew she loved these people and wanted to spend time with them, but it wasn't goodbye just yet. Everyone was crashing here. They'd be here in the morning. He doubted she would tear herself away, so he'd do it for her. He scooped her off the couch and told her, "Say goodnight, Shepard." And everyone chimed in with, "Good night, Shepard," laughing as he carried her up the stairs. He was, fortunately, much more sober than he had been earlier. So, what's with the biotics tonight? She smiled at him. It was an answer to the question you asked about, what is she doing with her arms? He laughed, put her on the floor, and pushed her toward the closet. He locked the door because the rest of the apartment had not the steadiest company, and he'd like to prevent more unauthorized vids. I'm gonna get you to try the hot tub tonight. Turians don't swim. You don't have to swim, I told you. And the water is hotter than I like it, which means probably perfect for you. Come on. Try something new. She headed that way in a peach silk robe, and damned if that wasn't convincing. Took him a bit longer to strip. By the time he got there, she was submerged in the water, head tilted back against the tile. She was sitting in a corner, her arms out to either side. They hadn't had all that much time in the apartment together, both of them completely unable to pull away from the war effort, interrupted often and on different schedules. After a few attempts at staying here, they'd met back on the Normandy with faster access to solutions. It might be the first time she'd tried the hot tub herself. Tonight was different, because there would be no interruptions. Not unless someone physically crashed through the front of the apartment, but even then he had his doubts that they could make it up the stairs considering everyone that was downstairs. He was at least grateful that the main bedroom had no external access and no windows. He was also grateful that he'd hired private Turian security, people he knew, and they were always watching over the place. He leaned on the doorway frame for a long moment, looking at her partly for the pure pleasure of doing so and partly to parse her mood. There was knowledge about Moram, and there was wisdom about Moram. He could know that she was tired, burdened, and frightened, and those things were all true. He didn't know this from what she said, because she was always careful to be encouraging and inspirational while still keeping her common touch, finding ways to charm people as different as Samara and Zaid. She didn't do it by being the same person for everyone. She tailored herself to suit her circumstances and company. It was work, and she did it for him more than she did it for other people. Knowledge of Moram meant knowing that she did those things. Wisdom meant... what? Confront her? That would make her more tired, and these burdens were not simple ones. They would not be relieved through discussion. Encourage her to share? That might make him feel as though he were doing her some good, but that was why it also might be self-serving, feeding his sense of doing something while not actually doing something good. Wisdom meant granting her some peace in this moment. He could do that thing that was anathema to him. Accept that she was in pain, and that there was nothing he could do about that pain fundamentally in words. And that his actions, moment by moment, spoke for themselves. Making her say it, making her explain it, would force her to comfort him. This was too deep, too far down. It made him think of a physical, incurable illness. If he'd forced his mother to talk about how Corpalis syndrome had preyed on her mind from the inside, would she have felt better? Would he have done anything beyond point out the obvious? Moram spent all day, and most of her nights, burning that fuel to fumes. They were helpless in this moment to protect each other from if. He would be there for her. He knew that she would throw herself into a volcano if a sacrifice was demanded. There was nothing he could do to change that. They were both helpless before the choices she might be forced to make. If he made her tell him whether or not she would sacrifice herself, he knew her well enough to know that she would have to lie to him. And he finally understood why, and admired that part of her. His shot at leadership had spread that mantle on his shoulders, made him so much more aware of how command transmuted personal choice into necessities of strategy. This wasn't like other choices she'd made. This wasn't a long shot. This was the only shot. Without her spearheading the effort to bring down the Reapers, everything was lost. Infinite stakes. Not in some potential future, as she'd faced before with a handful and then an armful of companions. Now the majority of sentient creatures in the galaxy were aligned behind her. It also wasn't a choice he would argue with her over, like her choices of going into custody, which was a potentially unnecessary choice with alternatives. In this case, there were no alternatives. She would want him to know that he mattered more to her than all of that combined. And Nora had given him that knowledge, and he didn't doubt it. He didn't want to force her to tell a broken, jagged truth that they both already knew. Or to tell him a soothing, comforting lie that he would want to believe, but would make her lonelier in the telling. If he forced a conversation, she would give him any promise he asked of her, and then she would break it when it was time for Schrodinger's Shepard to open the boxes of her choices. He knew what was real and why. Knowledge and wisdom faced entirely different directions with the same information. He loved her, and he would work as hard as he could trying to protect her as she did trying to protect him. He would protect her from the knowledge that he suffered as he did, and she suffered as she did, together as much as they could be, but alone with incalculable costs, risking not only themselves but everyone else. This was not about her. This was not about him. This was dictated by a greater set of circumstances she could not control, but would choose to confront. He would watch her do it without protest, and that was the sacrifice he could make for her. He would set her free from his smaller concerns and allow her to walk into the fire. It went against every instinct he had, and he would do it for her. He would do anything for her, even be helpless. She looked so stern, tired, the muscles in her face trying to relax but unable, subtle tension between her eyes and around her mouth. His instinct was to surge toward her, drag her into his arms and pull that tension from her bodily, to let reverie and the force of his ardor drive it from her until her mouth and brow twisted under the strain of pleasure and then relaxed. He was going to need to learn to oppose his instincts and give her the freedom to fully embrace some of her own instincts. He took a deep, quiet breath and applied some of his battle discipline to his body, setting the pace of his breathing, though he wanted to draw in faster at the sight of her. He calmed his heart, though he wanted to erupt and race to her side. Instead, he would find cover and be patient. Give her time to be who she wanted to be in this moment without forcing the identity of being his lover on her immediately with cheating Turian strength. He smiled at the thought and then relaxed in a way that wasn't discipline. She was burdened, but she was still herself, and she would come to him. She looked and felt delicate to him and always would, but she would not be as delicate as she appeared when it was time to fight. He wouldn't feel sorry for himself. Never that. The person he had been a year ago would want to slap him for not being fully appreciative of the options he had. Danger had always been a constant in his life. Proximity and choices regarding this exquisite woman were not to be taken for granted. He stepped into the water tentatively. It wasn't deep, as she'd said. He chose to sit opposite her, take up the same pose, mirror her posture. He didn't fit the same way into the corner, but he did manage to get in with minimum fuss. It was hot, and that was very nice. He adopted her posture, stretching long legs and arms out to his sides, tilting his head back and closing his eyes. He focused on breathing, steady and calm. She stretched out her foot and brushed it against his, then shifted and crossed her ankles with his, casually, making him smile, keeping his eyes closed. Being submerged in water wasn't big on a Turian's list of favorite things to do, mostly because it forced water along plate rifts, finding cracks and creating tickling, itching, and sometimes medically damaging reservoirs of water under plate. Then there was the potential sloshing sound with movement. Human showers were fine, but Turian showers had a system of fine particle blasting, followed by blowing air. They weren't found on human ships. It would more likely tear off their skin rather than clean it. He wasn't going to explain that to her right now. Right now, he was going to relax and wait, follow her lead, guard her emotional six. Well, relaxing was a little ambitious, but appreciating her proximity was a constant. If her proximity were a distraction, he could just go with that. He could appreciate that kinetic, coiled spring of need she brought out in him. He imagined untangling their ankles and pushing away from the wall of the hot tub to move toward her, her eyes opening with the startled pleasure his speed brought to her. He'd want to do too many things at once, and his hands in his mouth would roam. He'd want to touch her mouth, her throat, and her breasts, with water beating on her body and flowing down her curves and planes. He realized he was a little too relaxed now when he made a soft growl. He opened one eye to find her looking at him with one eye open. He smiled. She smiled. He closed his eye but kept his smile. He felt the water shift, and her ankles left his. Then he felt her hands on them, and she climbed along his body. He opened his eyes, and she was drifting toward him, the tips of her hair in the water, and she was floating. That is so cool. Do all humans float? She nodded and demonstrated. He sat up. We sink like the metal-infused near rocks we are. She slowly slid her hands up from his knees to his thighs until she had her elbows on his thighs and was keeping her head above water, the rest of her gently resting on him. He reached out and pushed on her lower back, and she sank down and then bobbed back up. So cool. He loved her laugh. The tension was gone from her face, and she had that adoring light in her eyes. He was happy because she was happy. His hands settled on her shoulders, and he stroked the wet skin with his fingers, his thumbs along her collarbones. His muscles were taut, wanting to do so many things. One set of hands not enough for all the paths he wanted to follow with her. He shifted one hand to play with her hair, some of her hair hanging over her face with wet tips. He pushed it back behind her ears. His finger traced the curve of her ear, and another finger trailed along her jawline. Her laughter had faded. Softness in her face. The humor on her lips joined with the warm pleasure from the way he touched her. His echoed thought of being helpless came back to him. Right now he felt powerful. He brought that expression to her face. His promises of restraint he'd made to himself were boiling off, and he was exerting will to keep his hands from pulling her closer. Well, he could honor the spirit of his choice to give her what she wanted by asking, couldn't he? He knew he wanted to see her eyes watch over her in her unguarded moments, as her eyes shone with love and blurred with pleasure and seared with the too much that reverie inspired in her. Those moments when he saw that she was as lost as he was, control exceeded, her body straining to stay together with his. He asked her, "What can I do for you, Venri?" Her brows drew together, and he saw calculation move back into the lines of her face and her mouth. She tilted her head in question. "Do for me?" He smiled reassuringly. "It's not a test. I just want to know what you want, so I can do that." She looked a little reassured, but still confused. "I want you to do what you want to do." "You don't have a preference?" Her brows drew together briefly. Let me think. I hope I haven't been too indecisive for you. Is that it? No, that is definitely not it. You're decisive. I just want to know you're not self-sacrificing. Because you are self-sacrificing. Her eyes flooded with a mix of vulnerability and stubborn. No, not in a bad way. I just sometimes run roughshod over you, and I should politely ask you if you care to be trampled occasionally, just to make sure you're enjoying yourself and not just humoring me. She pressed her lips together. I get that I'm a difficult person at times. I should say that my choice being what you want to do is because your ideas are always good and I'm never disappointed in them. And I want to be sure you have what you want. Do you have what you want? Is there anything I can do for you? He stared at her, shook his head gently, amazed how she immediately turned it around on him. She was occasionally a perfect mirror, all give and no take. She watched him shake his head at her. What? She was genuinely bewildered. Her smile brightened. Are you trying to have polite, impolite sex here? Am I in the way of some fantasy you've got going? I can try. He shook his head more emphatically. Okay, not that. So, tell me. What do you want, Garrus? Now, I'm curious. What's impolite sex? She shrugged. Generally, the stuff that requires more than your usual stock of Metagel or release authorizations for damages. Are we approaching some Turian kink here? Because just let me know ahead of time. I'll help as much as I can. Yeah, maybe this is Turian kink. I'd like to know what pleases you. Apparently that's off limits. She splashed him and he sputtered. You please me. I just said that. When have I given you the impression that I disliked anything you've done? Well, you beat me up that one time, and I was only trying to talk. She splashed him again, and he pulled her by her upper arms to straddle his lap, water streaming down her skin. She draped her arms over his shoulders. Garrus, at the end, at the beginning of every day, I want you to be happy. I know I can't always get that for you, but here, now, with this, with sex, I can. I want you to be happy. You seem to be happy when you're in control of choices. Like now you're arguing with what I want because you want a specific answer. It's not about you being dominating, though you can be. It's about the fact that you read me so well, and reverie is so addictive that you would have to try really hard to not do something that I want. Really, really hard, Garrus. I want you when you touch me. I want you when you kiss me. I want you when you talk to me. I want you when your hands are on my body. I want you when you want me. If I'm struck by inspiration, I know I can ask. I asked you to try out the hot tub. You came with me. What more should I ask? That you want me? It seems you do. It seems asking you to want me would be redundant. What I want, I already have. I'd feel selfish wanting more. He nodded at her. You're right. I am very agreeable. I am in this hot tub. I like the sound of that impolite sex thing. Here, I'll ask you politely. Moram, may I have impolite sex with you? She nodded gravely. I am sincere when I say anytime. He promised himself he would do everything he'd briefly imagined with her so recently. Say, please. She looked at her mark on his throat. Please, Garrus. Want me? Sudden insight regarding the cipher this woman had made of herself split like lightning through his lust, creating an empty space that slammed together again. She truly did not know what she wanted anymore, was too numb to wanting, and was open only to being wanted by him. She didn't love him less, she just couldn't reach for it to comfort herself, paralyzed as she was internally. She'd been asked to make too many decisions, she'd been forced to bear too many consequences. Being asked what she wanted was again impossible territory for her to navigate. She lifted her eyes to his, and it was written there. She wouldn't say it, and he would never make her say it. Parts of her were trapped in nightmare he couldn't reach. Helplessness tore at him, and he let it reach his eyes as well. So much unspoken but seen, inches from one another. The eerie, self-inflicted eye of the storm raging around them, lending eloquence of silence and the seen wall of advancing destruction. They couldn't stay here, not for long. The storm was coming, and the roar was in their ears and their bones. Permanent, unhealed, and unhealable damage lurked in the depths. His eyes held hers as his hands whispered over her face, the flawless skin and carnelian marks of her choices. Her regeneration factor overcame her own history. Now she looked pristine and fresh. In a Taurian sense, she was a child. No marks on her face to speak of her valor. Half his face was marred, kept that way by his will, and her choices were so often opposite of his own. She looked as though she had never seen a rough day. He called her by the name she'd had the longest, her identity before she'd met him, before she'd become a commander, before she'd become a legend, before he'd bonded to her, before she'd come back to him with eerie scars humming through her skin. Morin. He lifted her from the water, images of rough novelty gone from his mind. He'd imagined her gasping from the shock of him laying her down on cold tile, but now he wanted to keep her warm. He dragged a blanket from the bed and wrapped it around her rapidly cooling body, her eyes on his the whole way. She was too shocked and lost to cry. How many times had she imagined everyone going slowly or rapidly drunk in this apartment, ending up dead by her command? How many times overall? How many times tonight? He could ask her what she wanted, but he wouldn't be able to give her the things that leaped to her mind. She wanted Ashley back. She wanted Thane back. She wanted Legion back. She wanted Morden back. She wanted the Reapers gone. He didn't know if she wanted to live or wanted to die, but knew that the weight of grief was a fate worse than death for many. Was it for her? Spirits, I can't ask. The loss of her and the loss of 10 people under his command had unhinged him so completely he'd wanted to die. He said her name again, an affirmation, something to hold on to. Some call back to her having an identity independent of this crisis. Morin. He sat on the edge of the bed, keeping her eyes captured with his own, watching who she was. This is who you are, and I love you. He had faith in that love and its power to reach her, to work unlikely miracles. He moved his hands over her hair, over her face. When you're in the dark, think of me. You are my light. When you are alone, think of me. You are my bondmate. When you are lost, think of me. I will find my way to you. Her eyes flickered with recognition, seeming to pull her into this moment, away from the coming storm. She was quicksilver in her mood, suddenly voracious intent in her eyes, in her hands, and her mouth moved to his throat, her hands to his waist, her sudden change in course catching him off guard. Again. Always. His arms came around her, still tentative, gentle, and being careful with her, but she barely noticed and persisted, her hands straying to his groin plates until he had a sudden thought, stilling her hands and saying, "Wait, She had that determined look in her eyes that took his breath away. Not in the mood to wait. We have an issue here. Hold on. He stood up and carried her to the bathroom, put her carefully on her feet, wrapped the blanket around her, and held up one finger. Turian thing. She raised her brow. Are you sloshing? He shrugged slightly, stepped into the shower for a moment, opening his groin plates, water gushing down his thighs. You flooded your torpedo bay! He shook his head at her. You're a terrible person. I came loose in the water. I was trying not to, but you're persuasive. Any other, issues there? He shrugged. As long as it's clean water, I should be fine. I might continue to slosh for a bit. Thank you. Venri, thank you. I would be lost without you. In your torpedo bay. He turned on the spray to rinse off, and when she dropped the blanket, he yanked her in and shoved her against the cold tile with satisfaction, hearing the gasp in her voice that he'd wanted to hear. I love that sound. Won't your cowl collect puddles? Shut up, you anthropomorphic bag of dicks. She dug her fingernails into his shoulders. Whatever you say, nerd. I love it when you talk dirty. Tell me you'll do whatever I say. Again. His breathing lost his pace as he slid a finger into her heat, his other hand settling over one of her breasts. Her head tipped back. Whatever you say. He watched her as the change in her body, her face, her voice showed him how much pleasure she felt. His thumb twisted to play at her clit, and his talons drew to a point on her nipple, opening and starting over, from the base of her breast to the tip, testing the hardness of her nipple with presses of blunt back sides of talons. He moved his mouth to her ear, intensified the thrust of his fingers, the press of his thumb. You made me promise once that I'd live if you died, that I wouldn't throw my life away. Remember? Yes. Good. Now, I'm going to make you promise to throw your death away. You're going to promise me that if the opportunity to die presents itself, And you can make another choice. You are going to live. Whatever I say, Morim. He pulled his head back to look at her, his eyes full of lust, determination, and force of will. He could play her body and her mind like an instrument, and he was going to make her sing. Her face reflected the thought he'd seen her make when he'd asked her to tell him the truth. Her brows drew, her eyes closed, the concept of giving up her will on a subject flitting on her brows between the heave of her body and the tensed chords of her throat. He bent his head to drag his teeth along one of those columns. Tell me, yes. Tell me you will always come back for me. He pulled back to watch the twined strain on her face of pleasure and choice and being ordered to commit to it while her mind was lost to her. It was unfair, and he took fierce pride in it. The choices she faced were never fair. Yes. It was unfair. But she wouldn't hide. She wouldn't lie. Spirits, you are beautiful. He dropped his mouth to her breast and looked at her nipple, sharp points of his teeth on her skin. He twisted and curled his finger inside her, pressed at her clit with the insistent rhythm he'd learned from her body's responses. Her hands clenched on his shoulders, and the building cry of her orgasm rang in his ears. He lifted her hips so her feet were off the floor, and her weight was suspended in his arms. He drove his cock into her with deliberate and slow pressure, pinioning her to the wall. Her shoulders pressed again against the higher and newly cold tile, her gasp and moan as hot water pounded against his back and shoulders. He murmured words against her throat, into her skin as he bit down to taste her. You're mine. His words were pressed into her lips as he kissed her, as he bit down on his tongue. Nothing will take you from me. His talons dug into her hips as he looked at her throat as she threw her head back, reverie flooding her. Come back to me, Venri. Always.